straight you home. The Hofstra Alternative Web Channel, in partnership with the Hofstra Chronicle. And now, from Hofstra University, Hofstra Votes Live.
Good evening and welcome to the Hofstra Votes Live 2022 National Desk. I'm Yao Bonsu.
And I'm Crystal Bermudez.
And I'm Danny DiCrescenzo. Tonight we'll be taking a look at congressional and gubernatorial races across the country. In Studio A, we will be joined by our regional and national map reporters Jason White and Michael Richardson, as well as our decision desk reporter Max Coven.
We have team coverage all around the Lawrence School of Communication.
In regional news, all of New York's congressional candidates are up for re-election this year, and it may mark a major moment for Republicans in the state, with some saying multiple races will flip red during tonight's election.
Plus, New York gubernatorial candidates Kathy Hochul and Lee Zeldin are neck and neck going into tonight's election. Zeldin has raised millions of dollars to keep up with incumbent Hochul's support from many New Yorkers in the metropolitan area. We will see how it plays out tonight.
And we'll hear from our newsroom reporter, decision desk, and Max team. They'll be keeping us up to date on the midterm's most crucial races here on Hofstra Votes Live.
Thank you so much, Nick. We are reporting live right now from Congressman Lee Zeldin's headquarters and the watch party here live in New York City.
Well, thank you very much, Lindsay. I'm coming to you live from the Grand Ballroom of Capital NYC in downtown Manhattan.
Well, the trouble is that it's being blamed on the Democrats, whereas, in fact, the causes of the inflation are not being correctly identified. Everyone is seeing this as because of too much spending by the federal government in the past year.
The New York City metro area is where the Democrats are going to need to keep cashing in all these votes, especially for the gubernatorial races.
Thank you so much, Yao. We are here with our National Decision Desk lead researcher and head of our decision desk, Annabelle Hoffman. Annabelle, tell us a little bit about what you're looking at tonight.
Yeah, there's a couple races we're watching. The Texas gubernatorial races, always going to be a close one. Same with the Georgia gubernatorial, Georgia Senate. So those are a few of the top ones we're watching.
We are receiving word from the Secretary of State, Lee Chapman, that the unofficial results in Pennsylvania are unlikely to be called tonight. Just like in 2020, this is a race that will probably be called well into the weekend.
What issues matter to you in this year's election?
My house is crime. It's too high, something's got to be done. And also, price of everything. When you go shopping, you're emptying your wallet at the grocery store.
There are so many things differently weighing in on this election in particular, between early voters, absentee ballots, and then people who the polls had just closed but are still wrapping up on other time zones. So definitely just many different voters that we are looking out for right now.
Now speaking with Curtis Silva, he is currently running for mayor for New York. So how are we feeling this evening?
Feeling really good. Lee Zeldin is running on that crime train right to the governor's office. It's all about crime from Buffalo to Brooklyn, and obviously inflation.
It is just after 11 p.m. Midnight is around the corner. What else can we keep our eyes peeled on for the remainder of this evening?
We can definitely take a look at the governor's race. Hochul has 58% votes and Zeldin has 42%.
Once again, the New York gubernatorial race has not been called, but the Hochul campaign is claiming victory. I know we're on the national desk here, but nevertheless, this is one of the bigger races in the country, the New York State governor's race between Kathy Hochul and Lee Zeldin.
Other breaking news in the state of Texas, where Governor Greg Abbott, Republican, has won re-election to a third term in Texas, defeating Democrat Beto O'Rourke.
For one final time, Kathy will say that. For one final time, thank you for tuning in to Hofstra Votes Live 2022. I'm Danny DiCrescenzo.
I'm Crystal Bermudez.
And I'm Yao Bonsu. Have a fantastic evening.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this panel with the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication. I am Dr. Jinsi Christina Wu, and I am delighted to introduce my esteemed colleagues on this panel, communication education in a new electoral landscape. Farthest from me, Professor Ashish Kumar, Professor Nicole Clarity, Professor Vicky Semple, and Professor Scott Brinton. We're conducting this panel as a semi-structured roundtable conversation, so I will start with one question for each panelist to address for roughly 5 to 7 minutes, ask a couple more follow-up questions before opening it up to the audience. So to give you a brief introduction to this panel, the mass media ecosystem in the United States has evolved considerably over the last 20 years, completely transforming the way people engage with and exchange public information that impacts their lives. Nowhere is this reality more apparent than in our system of electoral politics, making the 2024 presidential election landscape drastically different from prior election cycles. While some would argue that the so-called legacy media have lost their agenda setting and gatekeeping powers, in a sense democratizing our mass communication, others have sounding alarm bells about how new media forms have resulted in unforeseen challenges, in many ways degrading our national conversation and threatening democratic communication. On this panel, we center our discussion about the media and the elections through the prism of the school's mission of educating students to become civic-minded media professionals and media-literate citizens. First, we'll address social media's evolutionary role in the last few national election cycles, which is increasingly problematic, especially in relation to an alarming rise in misinformation for a vast sector of the US public. Professor Kumar, you have identified a fruitful theoretical juxtaposition of active participation and engagement versus passive reception and enactment, particularly as it pertains to the rise of social media. Can you please start our discussion by drawing a larger framework of overall shifts in our mediated communications and how we can engage our students to think more critically about media's seemingly oversized role in our electoral politics?
Thank you. I have some prepared remarks, so I'll be selecting a few items from there to weave into the question that Jinxie has posed. So just briefly, I grew up in India in a family of journalists. My grandfather managed the local daily. My uncle ran a printing press that brought out a weekly journal. And I remember when a close cousin got a job as a reporter at a national newspaper, I pestered my parents to get a subscription for it. And this newspaper used to come from Calcutta, so it arrived every evening to my eager waiting hands. And one evening, I remember, I kept waiting and it never showed up. So I got on my bicycle and I went, because I knew where the news vendor's main office was located. And I arrived there on my bicycle and righteously claimed my copy. We are in a different landscape today. When I came into the US in the 90s, one of the top ratings leaders, and it consistently stayed in the top 10, was a hard news CBS show called the 60 Minutes. In the year 2000, CBS's show was dethroned and never returned to the top 10. And in the next decade, shows like The Survivor, Dancing with the Stars, and American Idol became consistent ratings leaders. In the discourse of today, whether it's in India or Latin America or in the US, we commonly find terms like prostitutes, anti-nationals, or leftists, or militants applied to journalists. How did we get here? What happened? To answer Jinxie's question, I am going to present a framework that sort of broadly thinks about two approaches to the citizen and their role in media. One assumes this passive, reactionary, almost like a choice that can only be made by a citizen who can passively take in information during an electoral cycle. So they're voters in the mind of the people who are creating media. The other assumes a citizenry that is actively participating and engaging. And what does this approach look like? Because this is the one that I espoused, and this is where some of our colleagues in the Herbert School of Communication have designed curricula around this idea of active participation and engagement. The active participant and engaged citizen engages with and through democratic institutions, including the press, to create and enact change in the local communities, and on occasion, participating in creating media as well. This is interesting because this framing is not contemporary, and it didn't come about in the last decade or as a reaction to to mainstream news. It has roots going back to the origins of the various print and mass medias. So whether it's a suffragist in the 19th century America who starts printing postcards, whether it's a Gandhi who starts bringing out a weekly journal to espouse his policies of nonviolent struggle against the British, whether it's a Lenin who publishes anti-Tsarist pamphlets while in exile, or hip-hop artists who start publishing and distributing their music on cassettes in the face of disinterested DJs and record labels. So we find this interesting kernel of participatory communication and citizen media amongst all these forms. And these two approaches are deeply connected to the ways in which electronic media were founded in this country. Now, it is common wisdom today that radio was founded in the 20s as a commercial entity that depended on advertising revenue for its survival. What is less well known is that in its ascent, it squeezed out a healthy strain of public radio stations that were founded and were housed in universities and colleges such as ours. With the advent of broadcasting, television broadcasting in the post-World War II era, this commercial backbone of media was solidified. But it is also notable that during this same time period, news networks were considered prestige points for the major broadcasters, whether it's ABC, CBS, NBC, and later on Fox. They accepted that they would not make money. They had other ways of revenue generation, and this continued until a certain point when this cash cow for the network starts to dry up. And now they're facing competition from the emergent media, whether it's streamers or subscription-based channels or social networks and smartphones, which starts to draw away these precious eyeballs that the networks has so reliably leaned on for the revenue. So what is the response? The response is we cut back international, national, and local bureaus. We turn to soft news. We turn to primetime news magazines. And what is the result? The result is a large-scale loss of public trust in for-profit, bought and paid-for news outfits, and a slow shift first to comedians and satirists, witness The Daily Show, who spoke truth to power, and then to personalities on social networks. In light of these trends, the assertion of an utter collapse of the public sphere and a hapless, uninformed or underinformed citizenry needs to be examined more carefully. Perhaps the so-called creator economy deserves to be regarded with greater nuance. When Gen Z turns to TikTok accounts from Gaza instead of network news, are they voting for community-sourced news by authentic, if untrained, sources? Preaching to them about the inherent risks of unvetted sources invites their scorn at for-profit media. As in the question, is selective framing of issues not a kind of misinformation, too? So for us educators, the question has become, how do we prepare students for a future whose center has become hard to locate? In an algorithm-dominated social media universe, which boosts only that which has computational likelihood, is it even possible to create diverse and vibrant publics? At Herbert School, we have taken the approach of returning to the public interest priorities of media. whether through hard-nosed, community-centered journalism, which my colleague Scott Brinton will address, or through storytelling collaborations with community-based organizations in television and documentary courses, we are hoping to intervene in the trust deficit narrative with alternatives. It is in this method of creation and transmission that takes place within small communities that assertions and truths can be transparently debated. As for that kid who rode his bicycle because he wouldn't be denied his daily dose of news, on an average, I get 5 to 6 push notifications from Washington Post and New York Times every day. Sometimes, when my phone is silent, I enjoy that moment of relative quiet. Thank you.
Thank you. As you can tell, Professor Kumar is an expert storyteller. My next question is for Professor Brinton, but as Professor Kumar already mentioned, there's this increasingly reduced local footprint that we should all be very concerned about in our electoral politics. Indeed, long before this 2024 election cycle, the institution of journalism had been already wrestling with a profound crisis, with public trust dropping as quickly as news outlets, especially local ones, are closing. It can be particularly distressing when we think that the 2020 presidential election results is still being disputed by roughly 1/3 of the nation's citizens, voters, as of late 2023, according to a Washington Post University of Maryland poll. And there tends to be a misalignment on actual metrics of our public life, say the economy or our environmental issues, like Professor Semple will address later, and people's perception based on their individual biases and, importantly, their media intake. According to research, local news can be indispensable in all domains of our public life, such as environmental issues, elections, public health crises. Professor Brinton, can you please speak to the role of local journalism in election integrity, voter mobilization, especially among youth voters, and how to prepare the general public and our students in particular better for the election?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is this. It's critical that you, as students, start to subscribe to local media, regional media, as well as national media like the New York Times. You can get a free subscription here at Hofstra through the library, and I would do that. But also, you don't have to necessarily, a lot of local media you can start to look at and dissect, and right here on Long Island, oftentimes free online. But in terms of its role, local media can play an outsized role. I go back to the example, I was in a talk earlier this morning, I'll go back to the example of offshore wind, for example. Local media played a critical role in defeating an offshore wind project because it gave an outsized voice to a local but small group of activists who were opposed to offshore wind. That's one quick example of how the media can, at the local level, amplify voices that otherwise wouldn't have a voice. Now, that's important, but at the same time, it can be to the detriment of our society if we don't all get involved and we're not all paying attention to local media. Now, that might be your hometown newspaper, that might be your hometown local television station, but it's critical that you watch them because your life plays out at the local level. The national races are critical and important that we watch them and pay close attention to them, but your life plays out locally. And those issues that they're discussing at the national level play out at the state level, the regional level, and then the hyperlocal level. And so the question becomes for us as media, in journalism, like how can we bring students to the stories? And so, for example, in my classes, my advanced reporting classes here today, they're out covering stories at the local level, the village level, the town level, the city level, where the politics of the nation oftentimes play out at that hyperlocal level. Now, to me, the scariest thing today is that we all tend to live in echo chambers. When we're enveloped in our own social media, the algorithm tends to favor that which we favor. It wants to give you what you want. And what we don't have are dissenting voices. And what you typically get in a newspaper are dissenting voices, or at least in the past, we've gotten dissenting voices, ideas that are different than your own. So, for example, on the New York Times op-ed page, you'll have Republican, you'll have Democrat, you'll have liberal, you'll have conservative. It's important that we understand each other, our different viewpoints, and at a deeper level. Now, the problem again, though, is that when I go on my Twitter feed, that's not news. That's not news. A lot of people these days, statistically, we're told that a lot of people are getting their, particularly young people, are getting a lot of their news from social media. And that's fine to one degree or another, except that here's the thing, is that when I go through that feed, very rarely do I actually encounter an issue. Mostly what I'm getting are accusations. Mostly what I'm getting are just angry rants, and that's scary. Or I get mockery. And that's scary to me because we're not looking at issues. So I would encourage every one of you to think in these terms. Subscribe to a newspaper. Subscribe to a magazine. Subscribe to newspapers and magazines that you do not necessarily agree with their voice all of the time. That's okay. That's healthy if you don't agree with somebody all of the time. But it's important that you try to understand their viewpoint. And the only way you're going to be able to understand that viewpoint if it's presented to you in a way in which they're not being mocked, they're not being harassed. So much of social media these days, and I understand why people turn to Instagram, because it's happy photos all the time. I ask my students that all the time. Why is Instagram so popular? Because it's a happy place most of the time. You turn to Twitter and it's an angry place most of the time. Well, somewhere in the middle there is journalism, where it's supposed to be, and oftentimes is, giving you both sides of the equation. The only trouble is, as Professor Kumar mentioned, we are losing our place as journalists in the world because we are, again, people are not subscribing the way they once did. They are not paying attention the way they once did. And if we don't support journalism and journalists, we will lose our place. I used to be executive editor of a very large newspaper group here on Long Island. That newspaper group, I headed a newsroom where we had 26 full-time staff. That newsroom is now down to 16. That's only 3 years ago. That's a scary thought to me, because there are 10 fewer journalists who are covering all of Nassau County. So please, if you would consider it, subscribe, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And also pay attention to local elections, right? Local discussions about national politics. So next, Professor Semple, as a public relations expert and professor, nowhere else, speaking of, are we witnessing more powerful manifestations of PR's role in our public policy discourses and political engagement. Immediately upon President Biden's announcement to drop out of the race on X out of all possible platforms, the meme machine went to work to promote the Harris campaign, some more organically than others. However, your research is also sounding alarm about the continued lack of attention toward more long-lasting and complex issues like climate change outside of the periodic natural disasters. Can you please speak more about that, and especially how we could turn things around, short of a better way to put it?
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the social media landscape that we're also involved with or watching, and then provide maybe some ideas to try to get voices heard and to make movement with the cause of climate change and wanting changes in legislation, especially amongst you, Generation Z, who have shown the most interest and want most change in climate change and environmental issues. So as we know, social media, the issue with social media in the landscape is that it reduces, it simplifies. We see this all the time. After the last Harris-Trump debate, we all saw the next day the many memes that went around. Perhaps you had a laugh or two, you shared them, but it was reduced to these memes. And that is very much a distraction from the larger politics and policy discussions that we should be having that should, be informing coming out of a debate. If you remember, if you watched the debate, there was only one question on the environment. And this, again, by tons of research shows that your generation, this is the number one concern for you. And so we see one question come up in that debate, and it was asked, and Kamala Harris responded, and she talked a bit about it being an issue for the younger generation. Then she went into the economy and clean energy economy. It then shifted to manufacturing and the automobile industry. She ran out of time. Moderators ended that. Went to Trump, who responded about automotive industry, and then pivoted to Ukraine and Biden. That was it. That was the environmental discussion. And like I said, we all saw the memes the next day, but I should also point out that even in a debate, we're dealing with a legacy media, we're dealing with television. That is a soundbite society. Again, environmental issues are complex, they're nuanced, they require legislation and law. And that legacy media like television does not lend itself well to complex topics. So as a PR person here, I can tell you that in PR, a strategy that's often used and always used is audience-centered messaging. And so that's understanding who is your audience. And, practitioners are very aware that complex issues don't lend themselves to simplified media. So if you are talking about environmental issues, and earlier this summer, the Chevron deference ruling was put out by the Supreme Court. It's complicated, it's complex. That is better suited for a PR practitioner were to try to get opinion around that and make influence with their publics. It would be suggested, this is better for print, whether you're reading it on a screen or in a hard copy publication, right? A complex issue is much better for print. You can go back, you can reread it, you can take the time to understand it. Social media, right? We're screening, we're swiping, we're scrolling through. Television, it's going past really quick. And so this is where problems arise with social media when you're talking about more complex issues. In this case, I'm talking about the environment. So because climate change requires policy changes, enactment, and enforcement, we're not going to see those types of stories play out and gain traction like stories about migrants or memes of childless cat ladies, right? That's going to work in social media. So I'm going to present to you some strategic solutions that have, research has shown that have worked with environmental policy, specifically with social media. And that is kind of piggybacking off what Professor Brinton was talking about, is taking these large, complex, bigger than life seem like issues, right, of climate change and niching it down and bringing it down to a local level. That is much easier to share on social media, and it's also easier to motivate audiences. So this local framing is one way in which, if you yourself out there as a student and you're concerned about environmental issues and you want to use social media to help advocate to get your point across, if you can locally frame it, it helps filter messages down, it helps motivate young people, it helps motivate local politicians, it helps motivate local reporters to see the story and report on it, and that can help affect change. So to give you just two quick examples here on Long Island, earlier this season we saw, if you live out in Suffolk County or watch the local news, there was major flooding that went out around Stony Brook area. It washed out roads. It was called the catastrophe. Obviously, it's because of the effects of climate change and larger weather-related events, but that's going to have a larger impact talking about that and getting motivation and thinking about how that can affect change at a local level than talking about the big story of climate change and rising sea levels and the warming of the climate. And that did get local press coverage. But another example would be there have been reports, and this is a smaller story, maybe you haven't heard about it, but Another example of taking something local and small and attributing it to the larger climate change issue is there have been cases of, it sounds gross, but flesh-eating bacteria on Long Island. And flesh-eating bacteria typically is a naturally forming bacteria that survives in warmer waters. We have warmer waters because of climate change, and there have been cases of it now on Long Island. So think about how viral, how gross, but how viral those videos would go of seeing flesh-eating bacteria that someone has picked up with their recreational summer on Long Island. And that can speak to larger issues that come out of environmental legislation, and again, starting at the local level. One other strategy I wanted to also talk about is that we can talk about this, but I have to be cognizant that we're in a very politicized environment, right? So there's climate deniers, there's climate change advocates. And so one other strategy that can be used is what's called the inoculation theory, and that is to deal with the misinformation that is out there, with all the climate deniers that are trying to, take down positive traction with climate change agendas. And I would be remiss if talking about public relations, I didn't talk about greenwashing. And greenwashing is when corporations like Exxon, they had 350 ads, ExxonMobil here in New York, trying to convince legislation to not pass legislation to avoid any gas in any new buildings that were going to be erected in New York. And they make it look like it's coming from a grassroots and a nonprofit, but it's very much, trying to support their own agenda. And so it's really important to understand that there's an inoculation theory that can be put into place. And what that means is you're going to see misinformation, you're going to see disinformation. But from a strategic communication point of view, if you can tell your publics, like, you're going to hear this, that, and the other thing, or X, Y, and Z, and you tell your audience that before the opposing side does put out that information, when they do hear that information, perhaps it'll raise that alarm, like, oh, I did hear it. So that's why it's called inoculation, right? It's like when you get your flu shot, you're getting a little bit of the virus, so that when you do get the full virus, you can fight it off better. It's the same idea. And so this idea has been, this strategy has been used in climate change social media campaigns and has had success. It forces the audience to take the time and do the research and not believe everything that you scroll past really quickly. And so because of time, I just want to leave you off with a little bit of hope. And that is your generation and anyone under the age of 40 is 50% of the electorate right now. So that gives you guys a lot of leverage. At the same time, an interesting statistic I came across, I think it was in Rolling Stone, is that in Congress, the people making our laws, only 5% are under the age of 40. And so you also have to be cognizant of the fact that we tend to select messages that resonate with us. So if you're a woman, you're going to be perhaps more inclined to listen to messages about women. If there's a minority issue and you're a minority, you're going to pay more attention. So if Congress and the older generation are more resistant to making policy on environmental issues, perhaps it's because they have investments in the big oil companies and they're near retirement and they're worried about their retirement, right? Or for politicians, perhaps they were paid by some of these big oil companies and they have favors to pay, right? But the bottom line is you also have that power to understand how can you craft the way that you want to communicate in a way that will resonate with everybody, including boomers who might be getting ready for retirement and are concerned on that side of their investments in their retirement portfolio and how climate change might affect them. So it's important to get your message out there, but also understand how we listen to audiences and how we adhere to those audiences depending upon our own standpoint, where we are in society. Thank you.
Thank you. As the moderator, I apologize that I run my panels very fast-paced. So please feel free to ask follow-up questions if you want to expand on some of these theories and ideas. So the snazzy reel that you walked into that played on the screen is a labor of love by our school. A lot of our faculty don't go home during that week of broadcasting production efforts. So Professor Clarity is actually one such faculty member that's heavily involved in this much anticipated Herbert School multi-platform election night broadcast, Hofstra Votes Live. It is coming back for the 4th time this year. As a faculty mentor intimately involved in the production efforts, you're essentially on the front line, both educating our future media professionals and nurturing the next generation of citizens that hopefully will bring things back on track. And you mentioned that your task is to push students out of their comfort zone and make them care through such student-produced, faculty-advised, co-curricular, and interdisciplinary engagements. While we continue to see a lack of enthusiasm, speaking of, about the election among youth voters, and a nagging sense of doom and apathy, how do you see Hofstra Votes Live as a vehicle of critical, civic, and media education, and what are some other educational opportunities that you see in the higher education setting?
So just to sort of explain a little bit about what some of those terms meant and how it refers to Hofstra Votes Live. Hofstra Votes Live is a production that is fairly unique in that it is interdisciplinary. We have students from all across the School of Common and many different majors participating, and that's radio, television, film, journalism, media studies, public relations, and everyone comes together and brings their set of skills to the project in different ways, whether it's, our PR team that's going out and sharing on social media details of the upcoming broadcast, or whether it's, journalists who are, putting the stories together out in the field or reporting live on election night, as we saw in the video, and even film students who are doing behind-the-scenes documentaries on the coverage. It's co-curricular in that we do have classes that run alongside of our Hofstra Votes Live coverage that helps to give the students the knowledge on covering elections and then also production knowledge as well to be able to put this broadcast on the air. And so there's it's a mix of everything, which makes it interesting to oversee, but it also makes it a really great project that everyone can kind of take part in and participate in, and I hope a lot of you here who are students will participate in it this year. And it's interesting because while it's seen as this big production that focuses on following the election and broadcasting the results of the election, it really is a vehicle to teach students about politics and elections and election coverage. So first, students have to learn about elections and how they work before they can learn how to cover them. And that's what we cover a lot in our classes and in our meetings, our faculty meetings with the students. And this year, because it was a presidential election, we actually started our Hofstra Votes Live coverage in the spring semester. So we started with coverage of Super Tuesday election, and we did a mini broadcast covering that. And for a lot of students, right, this is your first time voting or first time voting in a presidential election, and maybe you don't know how everything really works. And especially for students who might have grown up in a state where you have primaries, you might not know how a caucus works because that's not something you've ever experienced even on your local news or your parents going to vote. So it's a lot about explaining how the whole electoral process works, because every single election year, what do a lot of Americans complain about is that I don't like either candidate, how we end up with two people that I don't like, and it's through our primary and caucuses and how that all happens and how that all evolves. So it's important to know how we got here, and that is, part of that process is the primaries and the caucuses that happen in, January and February and March are especially the ones that actually end up leading to, who the candidates are in November. Usually not this year, right? So we had a little outlier this year. And so then, from once we sort of set up the process of how elections work, and again, how elections work on a national scale is different, right? We see a lot of polls a lot of times in the news and everywhere about, how many percentage of Americans like or dislike this candidate. And we do that on a national scale so many times, but that's not how we elect our president, right? We elect them by states and through the Electoral College. So that's another issue that we have to, talk about with students. How are we using these polls? How are we reading these polls? Or how are we understanding how polls work? Which is, a little bit difficult to sort of wrap our heads around. A lot of people say, polls are so inaccurate, but polls usually have a margin of error, and usually the results fall in that margin of error. And if we go back to the 2016 election where Clinton lost, but she was ahead in the polls, she won the national vote, right? So the polls weren't really that wrong. It's just how we elect our candidates is different than how we do our polls for the most part. So, and as journalists, we have to figure out how do we report them and do that in context where we give meaning to these numbers, which is a really important part of what a journalist does all the time. And I tell this to my students in every class that I teach, right? As journalists, our job is putting information into context, and that is one of the most important things that we do. So we also then, once we sort of know the process of elections, we have to go into covering candidates, and not just candidates, but the issues that are behind the election, right? So what is it that voters care about? What is it that they're going to be voting on? What is it that's going to make them choose one candidate over another? And so we talk about what issues to cover. And when we talk to students about what issues to cover, sometimes what students think are the most important issues are not necessarily what, the broader community outside of Hofstra, right, thinks are the most important issues to cover. So right there we think about not just what we personally think are the most important issues, but we have to look at, outside of our bubble, right? So we all have this bubble of who we are and our backgrounds and everything that makes us who we are. And for, students here at Hofstra, that's being a college student and being, having college education. And not everybody fills inside that bubble. And so we have to also look outside and think about diversity when we're talking about the issues that we need to cover. Are we covering all of our community? Are we covering the issues that matter to all of our community? And are we getting all different perspectives of that issue? So it's a bit of training folks and journalism students to be able to think outside their bubble, think about different perspectives, and then be able to go out and talk to different people from all different walks of life, which is really important when you're a journalist. So getting outside your comfort zone, that's something that we face a lot in journalism and journalism classes. And it's really important when we think about, going out and covering our entire community, which is what our goal really is to do, is not just cover what's important to me, but cover what's important to our entire community, making sure that our entire community has a voice. And that's a lot, when you talk about local journalism, that's something that's really important. And then we also talk to students about, right, all those different perspectives and the difference between objectivity and just putting information out there, regurgitating information, right? So when we talk about things like fact-checking, how to be unbiased when you're reporting on things, that goes back to the issue of context, right? And putting information into context is really important. That's why we don't just put information out that, a candidate might say something, and it might not be true, it might not be based in fact, it might not have any supporting evidence. It's our job, if we're going to repeat that this candidate said that, we have to put it into context, right? And putting things into context is really helpful for people. If I'm talking about the size of when we had the fire in the Amazon, right? We were talking about thousands and thousands of hectares and acres or whatever, measurement you're using, that doesn't mean a lot to people. But if I say that fire was taking up the span of basically the size of from San Francisco to Chicago, right, that gives me something to relate to. And so when we talk about putting information into context, it's making information relatable. And sometimes that means breaking down really complicated stories and complicated issues into smaller bites and localizing it, or taking a specific piece of that story, and you can even do a series, right? So there's a lot that goes into sort of the production, and a lot of it is learning about elections, learning about election coverage, learning about politics in general. And I think that a lot of the problems that we talked about on this panel so far, at least some of them, can be almost, solved here at the higher education level, right? Because we can inform our students, we can teach our students, we can train our students going out into the industry to have a solid fundamental base, right? And whether you take that solid fundamental base and use it to write newspaper stories or digital stories or social media stories or broadcast stories or streaming stories, right? As long as you have that solid fundamental base, you're going to be able to tell those stories on different platforms, and even platforms that haven't come about yet, right? That don't exist yet, but that will exist in the future when you guys go out there into the world. So it's having that strong knowledge of theory, skills, and all of that, and being able to take that into whatever area you go into, that I think is really important. And I think that's kind of what we focus on a lot at the Herbert School.
Thank you. And this will be a set of common questions for everybody to address in no particular order. But in addition to the entertainmentization of our politics, I'm about to make the conversation even heavier by bringing up the rising political violence and the observed polarization. So the premise of the questions came from our vice dean, Mario Murillo. So it's to his credit that he kept stressing, this is not a normal election, and we're facing this forever more ruptured public sphere with a lack of quality public discourses, especially about specific policy issues. But it is not a new problem. We've been talking among ourselves about objectivity and whether there were a better moment, there was this better moment in history. But increasingly, personally coming from China, among other authoritarian governments that are looking toward this great spectacle of American presidential elections and are drawing connections to their own systems in saying, we're not that dissimilar here from those non-democracies after 2 years of leading up to this big day. So how do we get ourselves out of this rut of outweighed focus on the form and the superficial and acting on the myth, disinformation, fake news, propaganda? So to go around the panel, what is the one thing we can do as educators, and what takeaway should the audience have with regard to what happens in the next 4 years after election night?
I guess I can start and go that way. Well, the first thing I would say is, as an educator, what I'm hoping to do is to help students understand what are quality news sources. Because I'll go back to social media again. You're not getting the news from social media. You are getting in mockery of the news in most cases, or an imitation of the news in many cases. And I remember, going back to Ashish's storytelling, my first news source was the New York Times. It came on my desk when I was 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade. In homeroom, the New York Times arrived there. It was 10 cents a day. And that's where I really started to cultivate an interest in journalism. I'm hoping that we can get back to the point where young people have the opportunity and the interest in newspapers, because as Vicki mentioned, or Professor Semple mentioned, print is often the place where you're going to, and now it's print digital. Most of what is in print is online, but that's where you're going to get the deeper reporting that you need. In fact, if you take a look at and you watch the news, particularly on the network news channels, a lot of their reporting is not original reporting. Most of their reporting comes from the New York Times, Washington Post. You still have the majors, and ABC, NBC, CBS do a great deal of original reporting. But if you take a look at Fox, and Fox bases its news reports around different newspapers than, say, CNN or MSNBC, but they're heavily dependent on newspapers. If we don't support newspapers by, one, paying attention to them, and then financially supporting them by subscribing to them, we will lose newspapers. We're losing a lot of newspapers, particularly at the local level. Your hometown newspaper may not be there 5 or 10 years from now, or even sooner, unless we, again, pay attention to them and subscribe to them. There's where print is where you will find the context. Print is where you will find the deeper reporting that you need to make good, informed decisions. As a journalism professor, my central message is this: the primary job of a newspaper journalist is to help people, citizens, residents, constituents, understand the world they live in, and to understand it on a deeper level, and to understand the world they live in so they can make good decisions in a democratic society. My fear is we're starting to lose that as we're inundated with social media. The only way to get it back is for young people like you to grab it back, because it's going to slip away otherwise.
I'll just add, as Professor Britton was talking, I couldn't help but think of Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, for any of you that are familiar with it. And I was just saying this to some of my students in one of my classes the other day, is that you have to realize, I mean, I know Professor Britton's saying it's important to subscribe and go to your local papers, and he's absolutely right. But then I'm also going to look at the reality of that you are all just on your phones, and I don't know how many will do that. I hope all of you do that. But what you also have to understand, what I was saying to my class, is that you kind of are just amusing yourself with social media, right? I mean, it is produced and created for the masses. And so what I was saying to my class is that it's kind of like, I likened it to retail. It's the cheap fast fashion of media. And so you're going to see the same, it's going to change. There's going to be trends. Everything has a trend life, right? Demure, whatever it might be of this summer, right? Brat girl summer. It's a trend, right? And everyone gets hyped up and it's distracting you. So just understand that that's how it is produced. That's how it is created. So if you want something of quality, if you want something that's going to last, when you go shopping, you're not going to H&M. You're not going to Forever 21. You're going to drop some money on something of quality. So when you want to educate yourself and really understand an issue, you have to come off of the social media and take the time to read an article and get the context and understand it in a larger context, because what you're inundated with, we're all inundated with it. We all get distracted, are the visuals and the cues that we see on social media, and it's made for mass consumption. But really what I think it's doing is it's just distracting us. You can get caught up in it. We all do, right? I mean, I've had my laughs at some of the stuff I've seen, but it's definitely taking us away from sometimes looking at what is more important and looking at the bigger story. And so I think that that's what young people can do, is just understand that, it's a heavy world out there. I get it. But, on a few issues that are important to you, and maybe take the time to do like what Professor Britton said and read the paper and try to at least get behind some issues. And maybe if everyone did that a little bit, we could make a little bit of change.
Just to play off of that, I think one sign of hope for the future is that when we talk about streaming broadcasts, so like NBC News Now and CBSN and ABC News Live, is tending to have a much younger audience. So people like you, students, are the ones who are really sort of driving that streaming video news services, and we see a lot of investment into that by the large news organizations and even smaller news organizations launching a lot of streaming services. And what I've heard from the content that is, sort of playing well and getting highly rated for younger audiences, actually more in-depth coverage. And they're able to do that because they're 24/7. They don't have the constraints of a typical newscast that's a half hour long, or once a day or twice a day or 3 times a day. They have to fill 24/7 coverage, so they're able to get a lot more in-depth into their coverage. So I think that that's maybe a sign of hope, and because that is actually growing in interest in younger audiences. So I think that's helpful. But I think something that we need to do, especially at the college level, is, I think all students should take media literacy, or especially news literacy classes, where you learn to be savvy news consumers, right? You learn to spot the things that are fake news or just, people out there ranting, the difference between quality news and just anyone out there with a Twitter account, right? And so a lot of information that's out there, the term fake news is actually my least favorite term ever because it is so misused. Fake news really only refers to information that is completely fabricated and typically comes on a site that is meant to deceive. And most news is not fake news. Most news is misleading news. And that's what's troublesome, and that's what's hard to determine, because most misleading news has that kernel of truth. So people will harp on that one thing that's true in that article or that post, and they'll see the whole thing must be true. And I think that learning to distinguish between that, the misleading news that has a kernel of truth but puts it into not the right context, right, puts it into a misleading context, and being able to figure that out and decipher that and figure out the difference between, clickbait and a good article. I think that's an important skill to learn, especially, for young people who are going through and being bombarded by so many things that are misleading out there.
To add to some very sage suggestions from my colleagues, become aware of sources that are public funded, which leads you to compare sources that are not. So, to an example, as Professor Wu pointed out, globalize what you're reading. Go local, but also think about sources that are coming from other parts of the world. There is an abiding interest in the American democracy wherever you go. When I was in India traveling, everyone asked me about the elections. Everyone was concerned in some way or form about political discourse in this country. So suffice it to say that if you're going to an outfit like The Guardian or the BBC, they're not just reporting about their local affairs, but they're very aware that there are publics in the US that are reading this content as well. Guardian, for instance, is a public-funded newspaper. Yes, they have annoying ads up there asking you for your contribution, much like Wikipedia, right? There are these public sources that have an interest that might be slightly different from that of privately funded media. To that point, bring back to your studies the political economy of media. It's something that we do not talk about in our public discourse often, is the ownership of media. I'm teaching a class this semester, which is very engrossing because it takes us into so many different places. It's about the television show Succession. In the opening season of Succession, Logan Roy, whose figure is modeled very much after Rupert Murdoch, his son is considering the purchase of an exciting new venture called Walter. What is Walter? Walter is something that is infused with venture capital. It's going to take journalism to new algorithmic heights, and there's so much hype about it. Walter is modeled after a news organization called the Vice. How many of you know about Vice? What happened to Vice? Does anyone know? It went bust, right? So it should tell you that infusion of money in the business of news is the poison pill. Yes, it takes money to produce news, but how should, as a country, we be funding this very vital source of public discourse? And I think that debate, once it has refused to question these sources, is the reason for why we are getting the news we are getting. Because you must believe that in a democracy, we get the government we deserve, we get the news we deserve, and we get the public discourse that we deserve. So it is we who are responsible. Research on Twitter, about 17 years of misinformation and disinformation on Twitter, put rest to the hypothesis that it is the bots that are spreading disinformation. What they found is that bots boost fake news just as much as they boost actual news. So who is causing the differential? It is us. Because fake news has this element of disgust and surprise, and it is found that humans like to share things that surprise them. Did you know this? Forward, right? So I think to circle back, the idea that we are living in an ecosystem of news that is funded in a distorted way. That has to make us question, where is the better model of news? Where is the better model of public affairs? And where is it going to come from? And I know that it is a marginal question in a democracy that largely supports private media, but it is a vital question nonetheless. And whether it's answered in the affirmative, the fact that the question remains is an important part of public discourse.
Thank you. And it was a decade ago when research was already noting that fake news travels 6 times faster than, accurate news. I don't dare to speculate how much faster they travel now. So our panelists have been gabbing on for quite a while. We would love to hear from our audience, you youth, you students. Of course, I have other prepared questions. If you have questions, please feel free to make a few steps over to the microphone that's in the middle.
Brooklyn, you can just go to the...
Thank you. And you can line up behind the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Holden Williamson. I'm a journalism student, and I have a question for Mr. Kumar. How do you see that, international public stations have a different approach in their writing style of their domestic and obviously international politics compared to American privately owned companies like CNN or Fox or something like that?
To give you an example from current news, so the war in the Middle East, there is an American lens to how you view it, and there is an international lens. So I grew up in India, and for decades, India chose to be a non-aligned country, which meant that it neither favored the West, neither did it favor the Soviet bloc. It was, as Indira Gandhi liked to say, it was upright, right? What that meant was that their lens on the Middle Eastern politics and the issue of Palestine informed their media in a different way. So when you read stories about the Middle East and what is the current, state of affairs there, you get this point of view that looks at the world from a different alignment. And I think that perspective itself broadens how you look at that issue itself. So it's almost like a removing from your own echo chamber that we talked about, which can come not just from social media participation, but living in a political and ideological bubble for the longest time. It's hard for us to get out and think about things from a different perspective.
Thank you so much.
Hello, I am Brooklyn Dye, and I am a journalism student. I actually have a couple of questions. One is for Victoria Semple. You said earlier that print media, in terms of information receipt, is better than social media, which, as previously stated, does not really afford one that luxury of synthesizing the information that you were getting. Do you have the same issue with broadcast journalism, particularly broadcast media, particularly broadcast journalism? I mean, broadcast does seem to be more widespread than print.
Yes. The idea of, a lot of this comes from an old book, David Borston, The Soundbite Society, but it's the idea of, communication messages for television, sound bites will always dominate. I started my career at ABC News, and I was young, just a little bit older than you. It used to blow my mind that we would we'd watch all the videos coming in from satellites, and a president is talking, or some, influential person, and no matter what edit suite I went into, everybody pulled the same soundbite. And it's because that soundbite was made for television. It was rehearsed. The person talking knew that this was going to get picked up. And so, to get back to your question, the idea of, is broadcast also, does it not lend itself well to context? Print is still better, because even with television, there's a visual that is going on, and it's one time. It comes across the screen. You do not have time to revisit it. You do not have time to read it through. Whereas in print, right, and as Professor Britton was saying, most of it is now digital. You can also embed links. You can take to other stories. You can, highlight a regulatory act, and if you want to, you can go deeper into it. So unfortunately, in a way, yes, broadcast is more popular, but it still will only, and this also goes to Professor Kumar's point, give you that one perspective. If you want to really go deeper, you're going to have to go beyond, and it's going to take time. And print articles are probably where you're going to find more of that context.
Would you say that broadcast journalism would be like a good supplement to print journalism or something?
I think everything has its own place. I don't think it's a supplement. I think perhaps if you're talking about popularity, it can bring attention to, there's a lot of examples, as Professor Brinton was saying, where you will hear of a news, all of your broadcast outlets have a morning rundown where they talk about what was printed in the Washington Post, what was printed in the New York Times, and they can bring additional attention to those stories that might not be caught by the majority of the citizens or, people in that area. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think broadcast can definitely help highlight those stories, but I definitely don't think it's a supplement.
Okay, if it is okay, can I ask one more question?
Sure.
This is kind of for all of you. How do you see people in the future looking back to how current news outlets, particularly privately funded ones, report on what is considered controversial, like with Israel and Gaza? Like, how do you suppose they would look back on how they report on that and see that?
That's a very interesting question, how people in the future would look back on our media ecosystem today. It's going to depend on a lot of factors, but I would say right now, I think that folks in the future would think of our current media system as in flux. It's changing rapidly. This next 5 to 10 years will decide, to my mind, the fate of our media, our future media, particularly our print digital media. Broadcast will be there for many years to come. Now, what form it will take in particular, owing to streaming, I'm not sure, but it'll be there because it is accessible. It is easily accessible. Print media is difficult in that you need a lot of resources to put out a newspaper. You need a lot of resources to put out a really good digital site. The reason the New York Times is so successful is because they have tremendous resources. And our media ecosystem is strained in that, I mentioned before, the local regional media that really forms the base of our media ecosystem, because 97% of newspapers across the country are considered hyperlocal newspapers, meaning that they have circulations 50,000 and below. So most of our newspapers that have traditionally formed the core of our news, their resources are diminishing. And so I guess people in the future might ask, why didn't people do something when they could? Why were folks so focused on social media, and why didn't they pay attention to the news organizations that were providing real news as opposed to memes? And it's really hard to get those memes out of, that cat and dog eating the cats, eating the dogs, just can't get it out of my head, It's really hard, but it's so important that you do focus, and it's really going to be depending on all of you. What are you going to make of our news ecosystem? Because the older folks, they're baked in. They've made their decisions. It's you who are going to decide the fate of our news ecosystem in the future.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anthony Favilla. I'm a journalism major. My question is directed at Professor Semple. So, you mentioned earlier about how social media isn't really like a good primary source of for getting like full context or a full story. So I was wondering what you thought of maybe as I talk to a lot of friends, I know a lot of people who will start on social media and then go into a story jumping off of that. So I want to know your thoughts on using social media as kind of like a jumping off point. Seeing like, for example, you brought up climate change, like seeing a post about climate change and then using that and digging deeper into it.
Yeah, I think, as much as you might hear us getting frustrated with how social media takes away from journalism, we would all be, it's here. That box has been opened. Everyone is using it, right? And so that's what I was getting at was, if you're going to be consuming social media and using social media, then there are ways to use it in a more productive manner. So yes, absolutely. That's why I was saying, like, if you want to advocate for for climate change issues and to get the environment discussed further in politics than just one question in a debate, right? Like if you're trying to influence public opinion and move people on an issue, then absolutely you would be lost without utilizing social media. So you just have to know how to craft a message on social media so that it will do just as you said. It will take people, it has the ability to spread and take people further and can go viral. So that's what I was saying, like sometimes you have to take a larger, more complex issue like the environment and figure out a way to kind of filter it down, niche it down, so that it does kind of have that ability, like we were saying with fake news, can spread so quickly. It has like those gotcha moments or did you know? But if you can figure out a way to take an important issue and get it to spread like that, then perhaps it will help bring focus to issues that otherwise might get drowned out with the cacophony of all the other stuff that we hear and see and fake news.
Professor Semple, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, I'm Farhan Alam. My question is for Professor Brenton. You talked about earlier how we need to find trusted news sources. You talked about how we have a prescription for the New York Times. You talked about how you were a producer before of 26 staff to now 16. I think majority of us in this room can understand the truthfulness of finding a trusted news source, but what about the majority of the people who aren't journalism majors? How would you go to approaching that to help people find a trusted news source instead of social media?
That's a really tough question, and that's the question that news organizations are grappling with. We've obviously, there's been a lot of lost trust. Part of that is the fault of news organizations which have not been transparent enough themselves in how they go about producing the news, who the people are who are producing the news. So I think, it's really hard because you've got a lot of elected leaders who are very much opposed to the news media, and that's natural. There's a natural tension between news media and elected leaders because the responsibility of journalists is to hold those elected leaders to account. What we've seen in recent years is that has gone to a whole other level, where journalists in the past there was a tension, but it was a respectable tension, and that we've lost that. All right? So that's problematic. So what have news organizations started to do? They've started to do things like present their journalists to the public. So Newsday has undertaken what I think is a brilliant advertising campaign where they are doing clips of their journalists, 1 and 2 minute clips of them, videos where they're talking about their job, explaining what they are, how they do it. In the past, journalists would never do that, but they would never explain to the public how it is that they go about doing their job. That was a mistake. And by the way, they're putting those out on social media. So, there you go. So social media definitely can help journalists get the message out to a wider public that, hey, we're here, we're working professionals, and this is the science behind the art of what we do. And this is the systematic way that we approach our job. And if you're a journalist, and my advanced reporting students are going through this now, there is a system by which we do coverage, and in particular investigative journalism, and the public should understand it. I hope that will become more of a national trend, and once it does, maybe the word will get out that, this is real news as opposed to fake news. I mean, you can literally create a meme in, a minute and a half, if that. It takes days, hours, weeks, months to do a real news report, and journalists have to get the word out to the public that we're doing that.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We're letting all the journalists ask the questions, any non-journalism majors. And I'm speaking outside of the other side of my mouth, I guess. We're also seeing that youth voters are the most volatile group, among the national voter demographics. This is a question for the audience. Whoever is brave enough to address it, please feel free to step forward, or for my panelists. As soon as Harris switched into the Democratic ticket, youth voters actually, the double-digit lead that Trump was having among this group switched over to Harris as well. So there's this almost nihilistic view about the media's role. Like maybe at the end of the day, after the entire discussion we've had about the media's role, people could come in and say, well, it's all about the people, right? It's not even about the issues or the policies. So where do we find the media's influence for those of you who are maybe volatile voters or non-voters, potential voters, or my fellow, one brave hand is about to shoot up. Maybe? Yes.
You want to come to the mic so people can hear you?
And you took the long way.
That's all right.
Hi, my name is Summer Severi. I'm a public relations major. I think it's more that Harris took a younger approach with politics. I don't know exactly how old she is, but she sure looks a lot younger than Donald Trump is, at least. But she was pushing more with like what Professor Semple was talking about Brett Summer, and she was pushing more of, I forget if it was Democrat or vote, but she was pushing in the same format as Brett Summer, like, oh, it's Democrat Summer, like, she's definitely appealing to younger voters more in a way that Trump hasn't. And I think that's why once she came in and it wasn't Biden-Trump and it became Harris-Trump, I think that's why a bunch of young voters came in and said, well, sure, I guess I'll vote Harris, because she seems to be more for the young voter.
Thank you. Someone else? Great point.
Hi, Holden again. I think that it's also largely that, yeah, people are just tired of seeing the same faces in the forefront, and knowing, obviously, you know, opinions over the past, who knows, like 2 decades or 3 decades, opinions of politicians in particular have been swayed pretty heavily by lobbyists in general. Knowing all of that, I think a lot of younger people find it refreshing to see, you know, someone who, I mean, she has been in politics, don't get me wrong, but someone who hasn't necessarily been at this level of politics for this long. Her inexperience almost helps her, I think, with the youth. And inexperience, I say that in quotes because, like, yeah, she's been the vice president for 4 years. But, like, her lack of being in the historical political establishment, like a Bush or a Clinton or a Biden or someone like that, that I think helps her in her PR quite a bit. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. 2 more. Oh.
Can I add something to that? I think this discussion kind of brings to mind this question that the relevance of image making in media, and it is so much, the shift in image making tends to become, you know, more central with the advent of television, because we are finally able to see our politicians. Many actually wonder that if the majority of the American population did not even know that Roosevelt was in a wheelchair because he would broadcast on radio. And from Nixon's time, that famous moment where Nixon's 5 o'clock shadow became the reason for his declining interest among the American public, it was very clear to Americans. And it's very, very, you know, for me, it's a historical footnote that Roger Ailes, the founder of Fox News, in the Nixon administration, began to advocate for a news network that would use media to push forward a certain narrative of politicians, because he understood, even at that point, how important it was going to be in the future. And when we talk about memes in the present moment, it is that through line from Roger Ailes, who's then decades later succeeds in founding Fox News and aligning with Rupert Murdoch and bringing a certain brand of image-making politics to us. It's very intriguing to me as somebody who obsesses over images in his own work, this vital kind of focus on image in politics.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Ava Della Pena. I'm also a journalism student. I think when Joe Biden was still the Democratic candidate, we were hearing, and there are so many young voters where the situation in Gaza, for example, is at the top of their mind when it comes to voting in this election. And a lot of them disagree with how Joe Biden was approaching this situation. But we were hearing a lot of the phrase, like, vote blue no matter who, which is to say, as Democrats, we don't want Trump, so we'll vote whoever the blue candidate is, no matter what they're doing. Even though we disagree with his politics, even though we don't like what he's doing, we don't want Trump in office, so we'll vote for whoever the other candidate is. But when we say vote blue no matter who, how can we hold Joe Biden accountable for the things that we take issue with? How can he take responsibility if we say it doesn't matter what your policies is, it doesn't matter what things you're doing, what actions or maybe the inactions he's taking, it doesn't matter. We're going to vote for him. Then how can we expect the change that we want to see? So when he finally dropped out and Kamala Harris stepped in, even though she's been vice president to him for the past 4 years, now Democratic voters who didn't want to vote Joe Biden for some of the actions that he did can finally say, well, now I don't have to vote Joe Biden. And I wasn't going to vote for Trump, but maybe some of the Democratic voters who didn't want to vote for Biden and weren't going to vote for Trump weren't going to vote at all in this election. And so now that they have this other option of Kamala Harris, who represents an opportunity for change different to what Joe Biden was presenting or was doing in office, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, we can now hold him accountable. We can now demand change rather than just saying, it doesn't matter what he was doing. It doesn't matter. We're just going to vote for him. So now we have a different option. We have something to change.
Can I just add a point there? I think that it's important to note on this that if you go back to the point where it changed over from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris, the media got that wrong again. Because a lot of the discussion on the network news channels was this, like, we need to have a contested election here, essentially, and there's no contest here with respect to Kamala Harris. Like, she's been chosen. But what I think the media didn't recognize, and that was the big debate in the week or so after Joe Biden made his big announcement, what they missed was the enthusiasm factor there, that enthusiasm for Kamala Harris had obviously been brewing. It didn't come out of nowhere. The huge crowd sizes that she's received and the enthusiasm which she's been received by Democratic and other Republican voters is remarkable, but the media missed that. Because I think in part they were focused on their own echo chambers, like their own thought processes that we have to have this contested election here. This is not contested. They were wrong in terms of in order to determine who ultimately had the right level of enthusiasm. And in fact, she had it, and the media missed that. So I think it's important just to note that the media misses things. It's the same way that in 2016, the media missed the enthusiasm for Trump. There was this huge surge there that nobody saw. It wasn't in the polling anywhere. So media make mistakes. It's important to note that.
And I think the whole voter apathy thing is important to touch on because voter turnout makes a difference in so many different elections, right? So if we were talking about the matchup between Biden and Trump, right? Biden won the first match of that, and voter apathy was going to kill him this time around. So a lot of times being able to get your base interested in going out to vote can make the difference in who wins an election.
Just a tiny follow-up, if I can, just to Professor Brinton's comment about the enthusiasm for Vice President Harris. And I see your point with the editorials, but there were a lot of political strategists, right, who were calling James Carville, calling for the Democrats to have a month of town hall meetings. Mm-hmm. So what's the balance? In that sense, the media weren't wrong. They were reporting on the news, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, there were others, Elaine Kmark, right? Others had Ezra Klein, right? As a commentator was saying. So just wondering what your thoughts were on the balance between that news and.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, basically they pull on the pundits and they, onto these, the networks, and they pull them on and they get their opinions. But oftentimes that, to my sense is they're choosing and hand selecting these guests. Mm-hmm. And these guests are the folks who are within, a certain sphere, okay? And what the media is not doing, and what they didn't do in 2016, if you went out and you talked to voters out, in middle America, so to speak, you would have found a lot more support for Trump than what the media imagined it to be. And in part, that was to Hillary Clinton's detriment as a candidate, because I think they overestimated the level of support she had and underestimated the support that Trump had, because they were listening to folks like a James Carville, I hate to say it, who's not a bad guy and a brilliant strategist in many ways. But, he doesn't have all the answers. And a lot of times, my feeling as a journalist, you have to getting back to that hyper-local sense, as a journalist, if you start to hit the street and ask people what they think, I think you'll find a different answer than that sort of echo chamber of these, network news organizations. That's my sense, at least.
And I would say you have to do both, right?
Yes.
You have to talk to the people who are talking about the strategists and the people who are, different campaigns coming out and speaking it. And then you also have to talk to the people, right? Because that's about getting multiple perspectives to a conversation.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes our panel. So thank you all to our panelists. And to the great questions from you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.